Today is May 17th, 2026. And what happened in the Strait of Hormuz this morning is not a symbolic gesture. It is not a freedom of navigation demonstration conducted on paper with diplomatic caveats attached to every sentence. It is not a carefully negotiated passage, brokered through back channels with Iranian authorities given advanced notice, a safe corridor, and the quiet satisfaction of having been consulted. What happened this morning is 2 United States warships transited the Strait of Hormuz in broad daylight, transponders fully active, in full view of every satellite, every maritime tracking system, every Iranian coastal radar installation, and every ship captain operating anywhere in the region. They entered the Persian Gulf. They completed their mission. They came back out. And Iran did nothing. Not a threat over the radio, not a fast attack boat deployment, not a single provocation from a command structure that spent weeks telling the world that its underwater mines had turned the strait into an impassable weapon zone, requiring coordination with Iranian naval authorities before any vessel could safely transit in either direction. The mines were supposed to be the leverage. The leverage just watched 2 American warships sail through unchallenged and did not fire a single shot. That convergence, the uncoordinated American transit, the silence from Tehran, the ongoing negotiations in Pakistan, where a 70-person Iranian delegation has been behind closed doors for over 4 hours, and the simultaneous intelligence reporting that China is preparing to deliver shoulder-fired anti-air missile systems to Iran within the coming weeks, is the most consequential single-day operational picture this conflict has produced since the ceasefire took effect. And every element of it needs to be understood, not in isolation, but in the frame that makes the whole picture visible simultaneously. But let's back all the way up. Because to understand why 2 American warships moving through the Strait of Hormuz on the morning of May 17, 2026, represents something categorically different from every previous phase of this conflict, and why that transit happening on the same day that Iran is negotiating in Pakistan with every relevant expert it possesses says something specific and decisive about where Iran's actual leverage stands right now, you need to understand the full operational picture of how every track in this conflict arrived at this precise moment simultaneously. Here is where things stand as of May 17, 2026, and every number and every indicator in this picture needs to be held in the same frame at the same time because they are not separate stories. They are a single story. 2 United States warships transited the Strait of Hormuz from east to west this morning in broad daylight, entering the Persian Gulf and returning with transponders active and no coordination with Iranian naval authorities. This is the first time since the war began that American warships have entered the Persian Gulf. Satellite data, location tracking, and confirmation from 3 separate publications all verify that the transit occurred and was completed. One Iranian state media outlet claimed the warships attempted entry but were turned back by Iranian naval threats. This is the same outlet that has been caught producing demonstrably false operational reporting on multiple occasions in recent weeks. The transit happened. The challenge did not. The Iranian delegation in Islamabad currently numbers approximately 70 people. This is not a diplomatic mission. This is a negotiating army. Economic experts, diplomatic experts, and security experts all traveled together, including a representative whose inclusion was specifically demanded by the IRGC command structure to ensure that the organization's institutional interests are represented at the table. The delegation landed before the American plane arrived. Iran was in the room waiting when the American side walked in. Negotiations have been ongoing for over 4 hours behind closed doors as of this reporting. Iran had publicly stated, through the head of its delegation before departure, that 2 conditions of the ceasefire agreement had not been met, and that their non-fulfillment would prevent Iranian participation in the talks. Condition 1, a ceasefire in Lebanon. Condition 2, release of Iranian frozen assets blocked by sanctions. Israel has struck more than 200 Hezbollah targets in Lebanon in the last 24 hours. There is no ceasefire in Lebanon. The United States has confirmed that it never agreed to release frozen Iranian assets as a ceasefire condition and has released none of them. Both conditions named by Iran as prerequisites for its participation remain entirely unfulfilled. Iran is in the room anyway. China is preparing to deliver man-portable air defense systems, shoulder-fired anti-air missiles known as MANPADS, to Iran within the coming weeks, according to current American intelligence assessments. These are the same category of weapon system that brought down an American F-15 during the rescue operation 1 week ago, a fact confirmed by the American president publicly following that mission. If the ceasefire collapses, additional MANPADS in Iranian hands represent an asymmetric threat specifically calibrated to low-flying American aircraft operating in close air support and interdiction roles across the theater. Iran's own deputy foreign minister confirmed publicly, in a recorded interview from just days ago, that ships transiting the Strait of Hormuz are required to coordinate with Iranian naval authorities because of what he described as technical restrictions. related to, in his direct words, many arrangements that Iran made during the war. He confirmed that Iran holds a map of these restrictions. He confirmed that coordination is necessary for safe passage. He confirmed that these restrictions are directly tied to wartime conditions and take time to be removed. This morning, 2 American warships transited without coordination, without notification, and without consequence. That is the complete operational picture on May 17, 2026. Now let's take it apart, layer by layer. Because the transit, the negotiations, the delegation composition, the unfulfilled conditions, and the Chinese arms transfer preparation are not parallel stories running alongside each other. They are one story about where Iran's leverage actually stands right now versus where Iran has been publicly claiming it stands, and that gap between the claim and the reality is the most important strategic data point this conflict has produced in weeks. Let's start with the transit itself, because the operational significance of what happened this morning requires more analytical weight than the simple fact of 2 warships moving through water would normally demand. The Strait of Hormuz, at its narrowest point, is 21 miles wide. Through those 21 miles flows approximately 20% of the world's entire seaborne oil supply every single day. For the duration of this conflict, that corridor has been the central instrument of Iranian leverage, not Iran's military capacity, which has been reduced to a fraction of its pre-conflict state. Not Iran's nuclear program, which Iran's own foreign minister confirmed to the American president, has been so thoroughly obliterated that only Chinese or American equipment could remove what remains. The strait was the leverage. The strait is where Iran retained the ability to make the entire global economy feel the consequences of decisions made in Washington and Tel Aviv. The specific mechanism of that leverage was the mine threat. Iranian officials were not saying that their fast attack boats would stop ships. Iranian officials were not claiming their coastal missile batteries would sink tankers. The lever they were operating was the claim that the strait had been physically modified, that underwater mines had been placed in the navigation channels, and that Iran possessed the map showing where those mines were. This meant that any vessel transiting the strait without Iranian coordination was taking a risk that no commercial operator, no insurance underwriter, and no responsible ship captain was willing to accept for a cargo of crude oil or liquefied natural gas. The mine threat did not need to be exercised to be effective. The announcement of the mine threat was the threat. The map was the leverage. And this morning, the United States Navy called that bluff directly, openly, and in the middle of the day. Not at night when radar tracks are harder to verify. Not with any ambiguity about whether the transit occurred. 2 warships, transponders on, moving through the strait in full public view without coordinating with Iranian authorities, without requesting the map, without acknowledging that the map exists as a document that confers any authority or navigational necessity on the Iranian side. The transit was a statement made in the language that matters most in this conflict. Not diplomatic language, not press conference language, but operational language, delivered by the physical presence of American naval assets in a waterway that Iran had staked its remaining leverage on controlling. There is one dimension of the transit that requires specific analytical attention, which is the question of what the warships were actually doing. The operational purpose has not been officially confirmed in its full detail. There are 3 credible possibilities, and they are not mutually exclusive. The first possibility is that the transit was a message, a freedom of navigation demonstration executed specifically to establish, in operational fact, what American officials have been asserting in words, that the United States Navy moves through international waterways on its own timeline without seeking Iranian permission. This possibility is the simplest and the most strategically elegant. The message does not need to be decoded. It was delivered in plain operational language to every audience that matters, including the Iranian delegation currently sitting across a negotiating table in Pakistan, who learned before their morning session concluded that American warships had just demonstrated what the American negotiating posture looks like in physical terms. The second possibility is that the warships were escorting commercial traffic, specifically the empty oil tankers that the American president referenced when he noted that vessels from multiple nations are heading toward the United States to load American oil. If commercial tankers are beginning to move through the strait under American naval escort, that represents an operational shift from blockade enforcement to active transit facilitation, which is itself a strategic development of the first order, because it means the economic architecture of the conflict is beginning to move toward a post-blockade configuration. The third possibility is that the transit was part of the mine clearance operation that the American president confirmed this morning is now underway. The specific warships involved may not carry the full complement of mine countermeasure equipment, but the initiation of a clearing operation does not require every vessel in the operation to carry the same capability. The transit may have been the reconnaissance and survey element of a clearing sequence that involves additional assets operating through means not visible in publicly available reporting. Whatever the specific operational purpose, the strategic effect is identical across all 3 possibilities. Iran's mine threat, the specific instrument that gave the blockade its enforcement power against commercial traffic, has been physically contested by American naval assets moving through the threatened corridor without seeking Iranian guidance. The claim that the corridor requires Iranian coordination for safe transit is now directly contradicted by operational fact. Now, let's talk about the mine situation specifically, because the current state of Iranian knowledge about its own underwater weapons deployment is itself one of the most revealing indicators of the IRGC's actual operational condition available in the public record. The Iranian deputy foreign minister confirmed that Iran placed arrangements in the strait during the war. He confirmed that Iran holds a map of these arrangements. He confirmed that ships need to coordinate with Iranian authorities to navigate them safely. All of this was presented as evidence of Iranian control over the waterway, of an Iranian technical capacity that gives Tehran a legitimate administrative role in strait navigation. But recent reporting from major publications indicates that Iran is actually unable to locate the mines it placed. The two explanations for this that require serious analytical consideration are worth examining in full because they reveal different things about the IRGC's operational condition depending on which one is closer to the truth. The first explanation is that the mines were placed without a comprehensive navigational record, that the operation was conducted under wartime conditions with dispersed units operating under IRGC command, and that the records of where specific devices were deployed were either lost, destroyed, or never consolidated into a centrally accessible navigational chart. This would mean that the map the deputy foreign minister described as the basis for Iran's claim to coordinating safe transit does not actually exist in a form that would allow Iranian authorities to guide a vessel through the corridor with confidence. The second explanation, which is operationally more significant if accurate, is that the individuals who possessed detailed knowledge of the mine placement, the commanders and technical specialists who conducted the operation and maintained operational security over the exact coordinates, are no longer available to provide that information, because they were in the underground infrastructure that American strikes targeted and destroyed in the opening phase of the conflict. Either explanation arrives at the same operational conclusion. Iran has been presenting the mine threat as a specific technical administrative reality that grants Iranian naval authorities a legitimate coordinating role in strait navigation. And simultaneously, Iran may not be able to act on that administrative role with the precision that safe navigation would require, because the specific knowledge that would make Iranian coordination genuinely useful rather than performative may no longer be reliably accessible. The American warships that transited this morning were not guided by Iranian authorities. They are not visibly damaged. The transit was completed. Whatever the truth of the mine map's existence or accuracy, the operational result of this morning's transit is that American naval assets moved through the claimed minefield without coordinating with the entity that claims to hold the map and returned intact. Now let's get into the negotiations in Pakistan, because the delegation composition, the pre-departure statement, the unfulfilled conditions, and the fact that Iran showed up anyway represent the single most analytically revealing combination of signals about Iran's actual negotiating position that this conflict has produced since the ceasefire. And they need to be examined in the specific sequence in which they occurred, because the sequence tells the story more completely than any individual element does. Before the Iranian delegation boarded its flight to Islamabad, the head of that delegation made a public statement. The statement was clear and specific. Two conditions of the ceasefire agreement had not been fulfilled. First, there was no ceasefire in Lebanon. Second, Iran's frozen and sanctioned financial assets had not been released. The statement implied, and was widely interpreted as meaning, that Iran was considering its participation in the negotiations conditional on the fulfillment of these conditions. This is standard pre-negotiation public positioning. It is a statement designed to be heard by the American side as a signal that Iran has leverage, that Iran has requirements, and that Iran's presence at the table is not guaranteed unless those requirements are addressed. The American response to that statement was not to address the conditions. It was to confirm that no such agreement had ever been made. American officials stated directly that releasing Iranian frozen assets was never part of the ceasefire understanding, and that the American side had no intention of fulfilling a condition it had never agreed to. On Lebanon, the operational record spoke without requiring any American statement. Israel struck more than 200 Hezbollah targets in the 24 hours following the Iranian pre-departure statement. The condition regarding Lebanon was not fulfilled. The condition was actively contravened by Israeli operations in the hours immediately before Iran's departure window. And then Iran got on the planes and flew to Pakistan anyway, with approximately 70 people, including the IRGC institutional representative, whose inclusion was specifically required by the IRGC command structure, including economic experts, diplomatic experts, and security specialists, including everyone that a delegation would include if it intended to negotiate a complete and comprehensive framework for resolving this conflict on terms that Iran could sustain. Read what that sequence reveals. Iran issued public conditions. The United States declined to meet them and confirmed it had never agreed to them. The conditions remained entirely unfulfilled. Iran sent its largest and most comprehensively staffed delegation anyway. And that delegation arrived in Pakistan before the American side landed, meaning Iran was in the room waiting. There are two ways to read that sequence, and both of them point to the same conclusion about Iran's actual position. The first reading is that Iran's pre-departure statement was a negotiating tactic, a public positioning move designed to extract additional concessions from the American side before talks began, and that Iran never actually intended to walk away from negotiations it urgently needs. This reading means Iran was performing leverage. It does not have for an audience it was trying to influence, and when the performance did not produce the desired response, Iran concluded that the performance was over and proceeded with the underlying necessity. The second reading is that Iran issued the conditions in good faith, genuinely expected them to create pressure, and then discovered that American resolve on not meeting them was absolute, at which point Iran's leadership assessed that walking away from negotiations in response to unfulfilled conditions it had stated publicly was less survivable than participating anyway, and absorbing the domestic credibility cost of having said one thing and done another. Both readings arrive at the same place. Iran is in the room. Iran is negotiating. Iran brought 70 people to negotiate, and Iran is doing this despite having publicly stated conditions for its presence that remain entirely unfulfilled. That is not the behavior of a party negotiating from a position of strength. That is the behavior of a party negotiating from a position of necessity. Now, let's talk about what the delegation composition itself communicates, because the size and the internal makeup of 70 people traveling together to represent Iran in these negotiations tells you something specific about what Iran's leadership believes it is actually negotiating for. A delegation of 70 people with economic specialists, diplomatic specialists, security specialists, and an IRGC institutional representative is not assembled for a conversation about temporary arrangements. That delegation is assembled when the party believes the negotiation may produce something comprehensive enough to require expertise across every domain that a comprehensive agreement would affect. Economic specialists are at the table because sanctions relief, the unfreezing of Iranian assets, and the reconstruction of Iran's oil export capacity are on the agenda. Diplomatic specialists are there because the framework of any agreement, its legal structure, its international guarantees, and its verification architecture all require diplomatic expertise to construct and defend. Security specialists are present because the military dimensions of any settlement, Iran's future defense posture, the constraints it will accept on its remaining military capacity, and the arrangements that would govern the IRGC's institutional role in a post-conflict Iran all require security expertise to navigate. And the IRGC representative is there because the IRGC command structure has concluded that any agreement negotiated without its institutional voice represented at the table is an agreement it will not be bound by. That is not a delegation assembled for a press event. That is a delegation assembled for a negotiation that Iran's leadership believes could end this conflict on terms that its various institutional factions can accept. The 4-hour duration of the closed-door sessions reinforces this. 4 hours is not a meet and greet. 4 hours behind closed doors means working sessions are happening, experts are talking to experts, and the substantive gaps between the two positions are being mapped in enough detail that both sides have a clearer picture of where agreement is possible and where the distance remains. Now, let's talk about China, because the intelligence reporting about man-pads, delivery preparations, does not exist in a vacuum separate from the negotiations and the straight transit. It exists in a very specific strategic context that requires careful analytical positioning, because interpreting it incorrectly produces a fundamentally wrong picture of what China is actually doing in this conflict and why. The weapon system at issue is the Man-Portable Air Defense System, a shoulder-fired infrared guided missile designed to engage low-flying aircraft. These systems are not strategic weapons. They cannot threaten carrier strike groups. They cannot threaten high-altitude bomber operations. They cannot intercept the precision-guided munitions that constitute the primary offensive tools of any resumed American air campaign. What manpads can do, as demonstrated by the destruction of the American F-15 confirmed by the American president following the rescue mission last week, is impose a specific and meaningful operational cost on low-altitude operations, close air support missions, helicopter operations, and any air activity that puts aircraft within the engagement envelope of a weapon system that can be carried and operated by a single trained individual. The decision to transfer manpads to Iran at this specific moment, while negotiations are ongoing, while Iran's delegation is in Pakistan, and while the American president has confirmed that a mine clearance operation is beginning, is not a decision that was made without calculation. China does not transfer weapon systems to active conflict zones as reflex actions. This is a decision that was made with awareness of the negotiating context, with understanding of what the operational effect of the transfer would be if the ceasefire collapses, and with a specific Chinese strategic interest in the outcome being served by the transfer. That interest is worth articulating precisely. China's position in this conflict is the position of a power that needs the strait to reopen for its own oil import requirements, that has been publicly co-signing American red lines on Iranian nuclear capability in Beijing, and that is simultaneously maintaining its relationship with Tehran as a future economic partner in whatever Iran looks like after this conflict concludes. China is not choosing sides in this conflict. China is ensuring that whichever side produces the outcome, China has invested enough in the Iranian side to maintain an economic and diplomatic relationship with Iran's post-conflict government, while simultaneously cooperating enough with the American side to avoid the deterioration of the relationship that Beijing's trade and technology position requires. Manpads to Iran is not a strategic intervention on Iran's behalf. It is a Chinese insurance policy. If the ceasefire collapses, Iran has a slightly enhanced low-altitude threat capability that did not require China to provide anything that challenges American strategic dominance. If the ceasefire holds and negotiations produce a settlement, China can frame the transfer as having been a factor that gave Iran the confidence to negotiate without feeling entirely militarily helpless, a service rendered to Tehran that costs Beijing nothing in terms of its relationship with Washington, because manpads do not alter the strategic balance of the conflict. The risk of this calculation is what makes it worth examining. Manpads in Iranian hands, as demonstrated last week, are capable of shooting down American aircraft. If the transfer is completed and the ceasefire collapses, the first American casualty that results from a Chinese-supplied manpad becomes a political and strategic problem of an entirely different magnitude than a Chinese decision not to supply oil purchases or to abstain from a UN resolution. American presidents do not absorb casualty events that can be directly attributed to a Chinese weapons transfer without producing a response that affects the full range of American-Chinese relations. This is the specific risk that China's manpad decision carries, and it is a risk that Washington is now managing through the intelligence reporting that has made the transfer preparation visible before it is completed. Now let's bring all of these threads together, because the transit, the negotiations, the unfulfilled conditions, the 70-person delegation, the 4-hour sessions, and the Chinese manpad transfer preparation are not parallel stories. They are a single converging picture that tells you something specific and decisive about the state of this conflict on May 17, 2026. The military track is at the most operationally assertive posture it has reached since the ceasefire. American warships transited the Strait of Hormuz this morning without Iranian coordination and without consequence. A mine clearance operation has been officially confirmed as underway. The naval blockade enforcement architecture remains functional, with the strait carrying a fraction of its pre-conflict commercial traffic. American air assets remain in the theater at the force posture that preceded the ceasefire. The IRGC's fast attack boat presence in the strait, which numbered 20 to 40 vessels in a typical pre-conflict transit, now appears at 2 or 3. Iran's air force, its navy, and 90% of its defense industrial base remain in the destroyed state that the American CENTCOM commander confirmed in congressional testimony. The military track is not applying new pressure. It is maintaining the pressure that already exists while adding the specific operational dimension of the strait transit, which directly addresses the one remaining instrument of Iranian leverage that had not been physically contested since the ceasefire. The financial track is at a level of sustained damage that Iranian economic officials have described in terms of requiring years, not months, to recover from. The blockade has accumulated compounding losses across the weeks of its enforcement. Karg Island's loading operations have been disrupted. The oil slick spreading from the island's storage crisis has been confirmed by satellite imagery. Every day of continued blockade enforcement adds to a damage total that makes Iran's economic position weaker in any negotiation that involves sanctions relief and asset recovery as Iranian demands. The frozen assets Iran wanted, released as a ceasefire condition, remain frozen. The oil revenue Iran needs to sustain any reconstruction of its domestic governance capacity remains blocked. Iran arrived at the negotiating table today, carrying weeks of additional financial damage beyond what existed when the ceasefire was first discussed. Its negotiating leverage on the economic dimension of a settlement has diminished with every day of blockade continuation since the ceasefire began. The diplomatic track has produced the moment that every operational indicator in this conflict has been pointing toward since the ceasefire took effect. Iran is at the table. All of Iran is at the table. 70 people, 4 hours, experts talking to experts, with the IRGC's institutional voice represented in the room. Iran publicly said 2 conditions had to be met before it would come. Neither condition was met. Iran came. That is the diplomatic track's current status on May 17, 2026. Not Iran resisting. Not Iran performing strength from outside the process. Iran inside the process, negotiating under conditions, it said, were prerequisites that have not been fulfilled. Because the alternative to negotiating under unfavorable conditions is not negotiating. And not negotiating means accepting the continued operation of every pressure in the military and financial tracks simultaneously with no diplomatic path toward relief. Now let's get into what Iran's negotiating position actually looks like inside that room, because the 70 people in the 4-hour sessions tell you Iran is taking this seriously. But they do not tell you what Iran can actually deliver versus what Iran needs to perform for its domestic and institutional audiences. And that gap between what Iran can agree to and what it can be seen agreeing to is the specific challenge that has ended every previous attempt at a framework in this conflict. Iran needs sanctions relief. The economic damage of the blockade is real and compounding, and the political sustainability of any government that continues to absorb it without producing relief is measurable in months rather than years. Iran cannot survive indefinitely under current blockade conditions without a domestic political crisis that threatens the IRGC's own governing position, not just the civilian government's legitimacy. Sanctions relief requires an agreement that the American side can present as having produced something real on the nuclear question. Iran cannot provide sanctions relief to itself. The path to sanctions relief runs through a framework that the American president can describe as having achieved the stated objective of ensuring Iran does not develop nuclear weapons. Iran needs the strait to reopen, not just for oil export revenue, but for import access to the goods and components that its economy requires to function at any level above basic subsistence. A commercially reopened strait means the blockade's enforcement mechanism is dismantled, which means the daily financial damage stops compounding, which means Iran's economic recovery can begin. The path to a reopened strait also runs through a framework that addresses the nuclear question sufficiently to justify the American side dismantling the enforcement architecture it has assembled. What Iran cannot publicly deliver, because the IRGC's institutional survival depends on not delivering it openly, is a complete and verifiable nuclear capitulation that looks on Iranian state media like an unconditional surrender. The IRGC's domestic authority depends on maintaining a narrative of resistance that gave the suffering meaning. A settlement that is presented domestically as a complete victory for the American side is a settlement that destroys the IRGC's legitimacy faster than the blockade destroys its finances. The IRGC representative in the room in Islamabad is there specifically to prevent a settlement whose terms cannot be packaged for the domestic audience in a way that preserves the IRGC's narrative function. The American requirement, which the American president has stated in specific operational terms, is real verification, not a performance of compliance. A genuine 20 years, not a paper commitment to pause enrichment while the infrastructure remains intact and the enriched material stays in Iranian possession. The removal of the enriched uranium stockpile from Iranian territory to a location where its reconstitution as a weapons program is physically impossible. The inspection regime that makes the pause real rather than theatrical. And Iran's own acknowledgement, delivered directly to the American president, that its nuclear infrastructure is so thoroughly destroyed that Iran cannot even remove the remaining enriched material without equipment from China or the United States, means that the verification architecture that makes any agreement real is already partially in place. Iran does not have to agree to dismantle something it still controls. It has to agree to a framework for removing what remains of something that is already obliterated. The challenge is constructing that framework and language that both sides can present to their domestic audiences as a win. The American president needs to present the outcome as having secured a complete and real denuclearization. The IRGC needs to present the outcome as having secured relief from an unjust military aggression, without having surrendered the principles of the revolution. These are not compatible narratives for the same event, but they are not impossible narratives if the specific language of the agreement is constructed carefully enough to allow each side to emphasize what it needs to emphasize for its own audience. 4 hours behind closed doors in Islamabad, with economic experts, diplomatic experts, security experts, and an IRGC representative all working simultaneously, is exactly the kind of session in which that language gets drafted, debated, rejected, and redrafted. The fact that the session has continued for 4 hours without a breakdown, without the Iranian side walking out in response to any specific provocation, and without any public statement from either side characterizing the session as having reached an impasse, is itself a significant operational indicator. Negotiations that have not publicly collapsed after 4 hours of expert-level engagement between a 70-person delegation and the American side are negotiations in which something substantive is being built. Now let's talk about what the Hezbollah and Lebanon dimension means for Iran's negotiating position, because the absence of a Lebanese ceasefire is not just a failed Iranian precondition. It is an active demonstration of the cost Iran has already incurred by entering negotiations without meeting the conditions it stated publicly. Hezbollah is watching Iranian officials negotiate with the United States, while Israeli strikes hit more than 200 Hezbollah targets in 24 hours. Hezbollah is watching Iran's delegation spend 4+ hours in Islamabad working toward a framework, while Lebanese communities absorb Israeli military operations without Iranian intervention or diplomatic protection. The relationship between Tehran and its most operationally significant proxy force is being strained by every hour that negotiations continue in the absence of the Lebanese ceasefire that Iran publicly said was a prerequisite. This is not a secondary consideration. The IRGC's institutional power in the region depends in part on its ability to maintain the proxy network that gives Iran strategic depth beyond its borders. Hezbollah is the most capable, most institutionally embedded, and most strategically significant element of that network. Every Israeli strike on a Hezbollah target while Iran is at a negotiating table in Pakistan is a demonstration to every other actor in the proxy network that Iranian negotiations do not produce protection. That demonstration costs the IRGC something real in terms of its regional credibility and its ability to maintain the institutional relationships that give it influence in Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, and across the broader network. Iran is absorbing that cost right now, in real time, by staying at the negotiating table. That decision to absorb the proxy relationship damage of remaining in negotiations while the Lebanese situation continues to deteriorate is itself an indicator of how seriously Iran's leadership is taking the necessity of a deal. Organizations do not absorb real costs to their most important institutional relationships. For negotiations, they consider optional. They absorb those costs when they have concluded that the negotiations are necessary enough to justify paying the relational damage. Here is the honest assessment of what May 17, 2026 has produced and what it means for where this conflict goes from here. The Strait Transit changed the operational equation in a way that cannot be reversed by any subsequent Iranian statement about the mine threat. The credibility of the mine threat as an instrument of coercion depends on the belief that ships transiting without Iranian coordination are taking a genuine physical risk. 2 American warships transiting without coordination and returning intact has permanently altered that credibility for every audience that matters. Commercial operators, insurance underwriters, the Gulf states watching the conflict, and the Iranian delegation in Islamabad all received the same message from the same operational event this morning. The mine threat is no longer credible as a deterrent to uncoordinated transit by vessels with the confidence and capability to attempt it. Iran's presence at the table under unfulfilled conditions, it publicly named as prerequisites for its participation, has revealed the actual state of Iranian leverage more clearly than any intelligence assessment or military briefing could. Iran is negotiating because Iran has concluded that not negotiating is worse than negotiating under conditions it does not like. That conclusion is the most important strategic fact about Iran's current position, and it was made visible by the specific sequence of events that produced today: the public conditions, the American refusal, the continued Israeli operations in Lebanon, and the Iranian delegation boarding its planes and flying to Pakistan anyway with 70 people and a full complement of expertise. China's manpad transfer preparation is the complicating variable that could change the calculus if the ceasefire collapses before a framework is reached. A single American F-15 brought down by a manpad last week created a political moment that the American president addressed directly and publicly. Additional manpads in Iranian hands do not alter the strategic military balance of this conflict. They do not restore Iran's navy, its air force, or its defense industrial base. They do not give Iran a nuclear program it can use as a deterrent. What they do is raise the human cost of any resumed American air campaign in a specific and politically visible way that creates domestic pressure on the American side. That is their strategic function, and it is the function that makes their transfer a Chinese decision that requires American attention before the transfer is completed rather than after. The negotiations that are ongoing right now in Islamabad are operating under a specific time pressure that every indicator in today's operational picture is making more acute. The American mine clearance operation, now officially underway, is a physical countdown to the moment when the Strait's commercial traffic is no longer constrained by the mine threat at all. When that moment arrives, Iran loses the last instrument of physical leverage it has been operating since the ceasefire. The negotiations that are happening now are happening while Iran still has that leverage, diminished and contested as it is by this morning's transit, but still nominally in existence as a factor that both sides must account for. When the mines are cleared and the strait is commercially open, Iran negotiates with nothing left to withhold except its agreement to the terms on the table. The mine clearance operation is the clock that is running in the background of everything happening in Islamabad today. The transit happened in broad daylight. The mines are being cleared. The strait is opening. A 70-person Iranian delegation has been behind closed doors for over 4 hours. Iran came despite unfulfilled conditions. China is preparing an arms transfer that complicates the picture without changing the strategic outcome. And the ceasefire that Pakistan brokered and the American president described as a favor he would not have agreed to otherwise is now the container within which all of this is happening simultaneously. Iran needed leverage. It had the mines. It had the map. It had the strait. This morning, the United States Navy sailed through the mines with the map through the strait and came back out. And the delegation in Islamabad did not stop negotiating when the news arrived. The strait is opening. The clock is running. The room in Islamabad is still closed. What comes out of it, and how quickly, is the only question the operational picture of May 17th, 2026 has not yet answered.